Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Gosztola, joined by Rania Khalek, the show's co-host. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And we're pleased to be joined by our guest for the week, Charles Derber, who is an activist, a sociologist at Boston College, and he's been working on mobilizing against the present crises that we see happening with the coronavirus outbreak. Also understand he's still involved in teaching some classes, so navigating this new normal that we are in for this temporary period here in 2020. So thanks for joining us, Charlie.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you guys.
And I think an easy way to begin is we all have different aspects of the crisis moment that we've been focused upon. And you've done a lot of work in the past covering corporate rule and the dominance of corporations over our politics and our very lives. And I think that's something we'll want to explore further and how that's impacted the responses to this crisis. But let's begin by you just describing, what it's been like for you. You're in Boston, and what has it been like with the coronavirus outbreak there? Anything you wanted to share that's personal, because that can be political, that's fine. But also, what part of this crisis are you most focused upon as you see it unfolding in the United States?
So let me start really personally and then go a little bit more broadly, because we're dealing with such a massive, once in a lifetime, maybe once in a century kind of experience that it's going to take a little time to walk through it and figure what's going on. But as I was telling you guys right before we started this show, so I'm still teaching. I teach at Boston College, and there are about 120 colleges and universities in Boston. They've all shut down, and that's hundreds of thousands of students and faculty and custodians and staff. It's just been a massive microcosm of how disruptive and how profound what we're going through is. But I'm going to start with what I mentioned to you a little bit earlier, which is a slight ray of hope, which is when this happened, I felt a personal sense of trauma and grief, because I rely on my teaching and other kinds of communication, person to person. For me, interaction, my oxygen is people and talking to people. And I thought having to teach online, which is what all these universities have gone to, every university in Boston and around the country pretty much, other than Jerry Falwell, who tried to keep it, God would keep liberty, safe. It didn't work out that well.
That's in my state.
Okay.
It's in Virginia.
Oh, yeah. Are you in Virginia now? Are you right now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, he's been shut down, I think, by the governor, but online. But the sort of slim, ray of sunshine and hope is I've discovered that online teaching can be very, very human and very, very, opening people's minds and imaginations in a way that I did not think was possible. I've used a lot of Skype and so forth, but being used by faculty all over the country now. I think a lot of them are terrible, and because they just lecture and people are sitting there reading comic books or whatever while they're supposed to look at notes. But my classes, just because I talk and teach in a very interactive, conversational way, sort of the way I think we're going to talk, I've discovered, much to my surprise and my delight, that the technology permits a kind of humanity in the interaction that compares in many ways to the kind of in-person interaction that I tend to have, which is very intense, very animated, very lively, very personal, connecting personal life to political life and micro and macro realities. And so just my little personal opening is to say, I feel maybe it's because the students themselves, young people, are going through a lot of difficulty themselves. They were evicted within 3 days. They had to leave their dormitories or their apartments and go home. Very often that was a very difficult move for them. They're dealing with parents and grandparents who are losing their job or, are sick, and they are worried about either their own health or the health of their parents and their grandparents. And I think that's part, and there many of them are completely isolated. They're self-isolating. If they're at home, they're in a basement or a bedroom or someplace where they don't have much communication. And maybe that's why they're so, partly why I'm finding they're so grateful and excited about the kind of interaction we're having in the classroom. So when we talk about all this stuff that we're going to talk about right now, I teach courses on, I teach a course called Economic Crisis and Social Change. I've written, as you were saying, Kevin, I've written multiple books on the corporate regime and the political economy of capitalism, both in the United States and neoliberalism, globalization, and so forth. So this is sort of my wheelhouse. And the classes and a number of the books that I'm working on right now are very, very focused on the issues we're going to talk about. And I'm just happy to see that the students are extremely receptive to this. They're feeling it personally. They're worried in a way, which I think is sort of an opening for our conversation, that the virus, as terrible as it is kind of showing some realities about the way capitalist society operates that are generally obscured or discredited or just sort of masked by the powers that be. And I think the pain and suffering that is so intense and so visceral and so personal in most people's lives now, um, is maybe going to open up a new chapter in our political history, sort of like the New Deal did. I think this is actually, just to give you a reading of what I think is going on, I think this is deeper than the Depression. I think that we're dealing with, because, in the Depression, one of the things that allowed Roosevelt to move things forward with the New Deal was there was a great deal of um, in-person communication and people getting together on the streets to sort of prevent evictions and all that. We're dealing here with an economic crisis that is also an interactional and social crisis where people are being isolated, which is scary because it's one way in which authoritarians can use the threat of the virus to separate people and prevent them from doing the kinds of things that are essential to challenging power and to changing the world. And on the other hand, the realities of people's lives are so um, deeply impacted at a personal, family, emotional, financial. I think some people have said we're dealing now with a new generation we're going to call the Corona generation, and that it's sort of like 9/11 but much deeper. This is not the 9/11 generation anymore. This is the Corona generation, and it's associated with an awareness of how fragile our whole social welfare system is, our public health system on the one hand, so that even people at your guys' ages who are presumably less in risk are actually at considerable risk. 40% of the people in hospitals around the virus right now are younger than 50 years old, something like that. It's hitting a lot of young people. Um, and so your generation and people younger than you guys are experiencing this in a very personal way. And I think the economic, consequences of this, partly because so much of this is being managed through the power of corporate powers in the Trump administration and in the Republican Party and in Republican governorships. And, the country is largely run by a corporate regime, which has moved further right since Trump got elected. So I think the kind of pathologies of that regime are going to have an even deeper impact on what we see. It's not accidental that the United States has more cases now than any other country, more virus cases than any other country in the world, that we're spiking higher, the level of growth in the United States. And I think that reflects the fact that the very development of the virus and the way it's playing out, particularly in the United States, is a reflection of the particular kind of chokehold that corporate America has over the American government, over the American health system, and over American politics generally. So the potential upside of that is that the pain is so big and it's sort of like the emperor's clothes are falling off because the things that normally mask a lot of the inequities in power are falling away as people feel, so much pain in their lives.
That's really well said. And I think you make a really good point about how this is the way this is playing out. It's like coronavirus is more of a danger in America because of the way that corporations control the government.
Right.
So all the responses to coronavirus are like just failures all over the place, from testing to the government's failure to force big companies to actually manufacture the equipment we need, to the lack of preparedness. It's actually really frightening to watch, to the fact that we have this an absurd employer-based healthcare system
Right.
that's causing 10 million people in the last 2 weeks no longer have jobs. It's like, what are they going to do if they get the virus?
Right.
They're going to go bankrupt.
Right.
To the fact that our government passed this crazy $2 trillion bill that leaves everyone broke except for like corporate executives. Like everyone's pretty screwed, and it's even worse than the best economists in the country could have imagined. I mean, 2 weeks ago they were like, we might have a recession, and now they're like, holy crap, this is going to be like Great Depression level, probably worse. So the reason I bring all that up is because I guess, me and Kevin always have this debate on the show where I'm like this huge pessimist about everything and he's the optimist. So I like the fact that you're kind of striking, despite the fact that you're being realistic, you're striking a somewhat of maybe not an optimistic tone, but you're highlighting some of the positives of how people might react to this. So I guess my question for you is, do you think that this kind of unprecedented historic shift, whatever's happening right here with the coronavirus, do you think it has the potential to change our economic system for the better in the long run? Because right now I feel really pessimistic and negative, because I see like the government's just kind of letting people not have the ability to pay their mortgages, or letting people get evicted. Like, they haven't put a moratorium on anything. They haven't done much. They're giving us $1,200 checks that aren't even really checks. They're just like advances for tax purposes that we'll have to pay back later, So do you think there's the potential for a shift, or do you think that's like years and years away after it gets really, really bad?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you put it really well, that the vulnerability to these health crises, and particularly, the way it's spiking in the US right now, and to job loss and a massive economic, crisis for workers, that's reflecting. It both grew up in the United States. It's sort of partly, some people have been saying that this is a disease of capitalism. This is a disease of corporate capitalism. It's, the virus is sort of the reason the virus is able to spread the way it is. And Rania, you pointed very well out to some of the reasons. We don't have a good public health infrastructure system in the United States. We have a level of inequality that is so deep that 50% of the American working population is $500 away from a true emergency in there. They're going to lose their financial viability. We're seeing a lot of that already. We're going to see unemployment levels spiking above 30%, but it's higher than 35%, greater than the Great Depression, probably within a few weeks, I would guess, because we're getting very early numbers, now already going up into the double digits that are not accurate. And so I think, corporate capitalism has laid the groundwork for a really devastating impact on the population. And I think so if you say, well, what are the prospects that this is going to open people's eyes? And, because in all the ways that you mentioned, Rania, in terms of the way they're already mangling testing and, supplies that the frontline medical worker did, and dealing with the financial emergencies that millions of workers are now facing as they get laid off or get, downsized in various ways. Um, what's going on in the country right now is a conversation about the question you asked about: is there going to be people are noting that around the world, the far right populist leaders like, say, Orban in Hungary, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Duterte in Philippines, or, all these, or, Boris Johnson, or, or Donald Trump, the virus emergency gives them the possibility of essentially declaring by fiat a set of emergency authorities that would basically wipe out democracy entirely in these countries. And I mean, we've seen that already in Hungary with Orban, and others in the EU, and others are already really, really sounding the alarm about that. I don't know if you guys saw that yesterday, William Barr, our esteemed Attorney General, declared a set of emergency rules, which would essentially give him and Trump the ability to use the virus to essentially shut down. I mean, it hasn't been laid out in detail. Did you guys see this? That it was reported yesterday that it's a fairly sweeping sort of mandate that they're issuing, saying we now assume the right to declare, or to assume emergency powers that would potentially shut down a lot of congressional authority. I mean, Trump does this, and the Republicans have been doing this, but this could take a whole new form. So one answer to your question is, you might see a very quick right-wing effort to, I mean, if you look at the history of right-wing, like if you go back to Germany in the early 30s, when Germany was going through a massive depression and people began to stir up, it took very little time for, Hitler was getting about 2% of the vote in 1929 and 1930. By 1932, 1933, as the leftist movements became quite strong, the corporate rightists in Germany decided it was safer to go with a guy like Hitler than to deal with, the communist and socialist and left-wing groups that were rising in Germany. And Germany had a lot of progressive feminist, you know, there was a real culture war going on in Germany, which was scary to the right wing and to the corporate elites in Germany. And they made a decision to go with, they figured they could essentially control Hitler. They were wrong, but they were able to make a lot of money while Hitler was in power. And the corporate regime essentially brought fascism into the modern world. And so that historical lesson is important to remember today, because Rania, again, you said this, as we look at the way the government is responding to the current situation, take the huge, well, you can take either, for example, the airline bailout and the Boeing bailout, which is another corporate bailout like we saw in 2008, which is probably going to go not to any benefit of the general public, which is not going to be doing much flying for the foreseeable future, but is basically going to get pocketed by the executives of Boeing and other big airline companies. And you're seeing that across a number of, oil companies and all the oil companies have been relatively, there's another thing that's involves a different dynamic. But the other thing is, which is consistent with what you were saying, Rania, is that the small business bailout, which is being proposed, is also largely going to be, I think, appropriated by larger corporations and not lead to, they care about keeping workers on the payrolls and so forth. It's not going to happen for a lot of the reasons of the way this thing is being implemented through, corporate channels. You can't underestimate how important, in a government that's been so chaotic and basically has left vacant most of the operative bureaucratic, agencies that would normally administer this stuff. In their absence, if you go one step, have acting secretaries of labor or health and human services and so forth. When there's nobody in there to answer the phone, they get the lobbyists in there, and the bills are written with sufficient latitude that the corporate powers that do understand the laws and do understand it are going to be able to take charge. So that's the sort of negative, not so sunny view of what might happen. Now let's go to the other side of it. So there is, I mean, you can see it. There's a kind of sense of, well, I don't know, one thing that really has touched me is how people have begun to respond to people who work as nurses or as even as delivery people for grocery stores, or even grocery people working in grocery stores. These are people who are being paid minimum wage or less and whose lives are put at risk. And sort of people are for the first time saying, hey, these people who are getting paid, $9 an hour and are, gig workers or contingent workers if they're drivers or whatever, these people are putting their lives on the line for us. And the kind of work that they do is life-saving. It's like it's the glue that keeps the society together. And, I look at that and you can listen to radio shows and listen to people who never felt their lives meant shit to people, just were devalued and, never had any worth as people in the economy, in the capitalist economy. These were failures. And suddenly people are saying, hey, you guys are heroes. You guys are keeping the wheels going for us to get food. And we are so grateful. And then you've got people coming out of the Amazon, Jeff Bezos, is worth about $120 billion, is firing some of the warehouse workers who are saying, hey, we're not allowed to, wear masks and, keep distance in the warehouses. So I think you've seen this, that, one of the leading, a number of leading worker organizers who just sort of said, I can't take this. I can't let these workers in these warehouses, whether they're in Walmart or they're in Amazon or, Whole Foods or wherever they are, these people who everybody is now recognizing are playing a really critical role in their lives, are beginning to organize, and they're beginning to, whether it's online or it's through petitions and through kind of spontaneous strikes, which you see televised now. The revolution can be televised again in a new way, and so the positive thing is that I think the exposure of what neoliberal corporate capitalism has produced in America, which is this enormous chasm between somebody like Jeff Bezos, who has this obscene amount of money and is firing workers who are simply saying, hey, could you give us a mask and give us, a couple more dollars so that when we go out and get hazard pay for the kind of, really dangerous work we're doing in these warehouses, whether it's in a grocery store or in a, an Amazon delivery center or whatever. So I think, and the same with nurses and with custodians in hospitals. These people who have always been treated like, failures are suddenly be seen as people who are on the front line, really courageous people doing really, really important work. And so, I mean, that gives me a certain sense of hope that there is a kind of paradigm shift in people's way of thinking about what work is in a corporate society, and realizing that the people who do this work have, for the last 40 years, since at least Reagan, have been getting nothing. They've been working double time, double amount, 2 jobs, 3 jobs. Their family income is pretty much stagnant, and they're now being, massacred by massive layoffs and massive job cuts and massive, much of the stimulus money is never going to reach them. And so I think when you put all these parts of the puzzle together, you see the possibility of people waking up to a new reality, seeing corporate neoliberal capitalism in a new frame. And it's very personal. It's not an academic sort of abstract thing that usually when you talk about corporate policy or the economy, people, have trouble following. This is real personal. This has to do with, well, is my father going to make it through the week? Am I going to be able to pay my mortgage? Is my roommate going to make it through my student debt? How am I going to manage this? It was a big deal that we just went through April 1st, and that's mortgage time. And a lot of people realized they weren't going to be able to keep their, mortgage going and also pay for the groceries. I mean, this is just very, very basic stuff that usually is read out of the paper, read out of people's consciousness, and people have to struggle with it individually. In the current framework, there's so many millions and millions of people who are simultaneously coming up against the pain of this reality that there's the possibility before the right wing takes over and crushes whatever, you know, progressive possibilities might exist here, which I think are considerable, that the population at large are going to emerge with a new consciousness about the power of these large corporations, the enormous gap between the rich and the poor, and the ability of workers using media and, you know, all kinds of social media and all kinds of protests that we haven't seen, you know, maybe since Occupy Wall Street, but on a much more massive basis, coming out and challenging the overall structure of our economy right now and the political economy that's growing out of it. Because Trump, I mean, it's important to differentiate a little between the craziness of Trump. I think a lot of what's wrong with the critique of Trump is it's focusing on his idiosyncratic, sociopathic, bullying, freak out personality, which is being used in an entertaining way to simply divert from the structural, by which I mean institutional, corporate, financial realities that are driving into people's visceral lives and affecting them very deeply. So I think, you know, it's important that programs like this, that it's great that you're doing a show like this, which is trying to drill down into the sort of underlying realities of the economic system rather than simply looking at what's wrong with Trump. And there's a lot to say about that. And, you know, I have a lot of problems with anti-Trumpism, not because I'm a fan of Trump. I think he's horrific and scary and could become another sort of Mussolini type figure. But so much, two things. One is that so much of the critique of Trump is coming from, like MSNBC, if you look carefully, is a kind of, it's staffed with never Trumpers from the Republican Party, people like Nicole Wallace and other people who might have good hearts, but who are bringing in security arguments, you know, saying, well, the problem with, you know, with Trump is he's not living up to our national security commitments, and he's withdrawing from our wars abroad, and he's, you know, he's doing all the, he's putting too much government into the, you know, in other words, so much of the anti-Trumpism is coming from the right, you know, in sort of under quote liberal ideology, but it's actually using CIA, FBI, and military credibility as a way to try to take down Trump, which is not a good way to build a revolution, you know, to sort of, so, and by the way, another thing that's just come out is that, you know, if you ask the same question, Rania, about is this more or less likely to enhance American corporate militarism? And just yesterday, it came out that there was a kind of mobilizing thing from the Pentagon, which the Trump administration is considering, which is sending new forces into Iraq because they say the Iranian militias are going deep into Iraq to destabilize the situation. And that just brings up a whole bunch of things, which is a bunch of things, part of which is that the way you deal with an economic, if you're a right-wing leader, the way you can deal with right-wing, you know, fears of power being exposed and so forth, is rally people around this war metaphor, which is already being used, and then actually go into wars. So
yeah, and also it's happens. They're doing the same thing with Venezuela.
yeah,
you have the Trump administration, right, like ramping up its attempt to overthrow the government in Venezuela.
Exactly.
It's like the war machine doesn't rest because of a pandemic.
Yeah.
It's just the opposite, apparently.
And I'm glad we're touching on this because, you know, the peace movement, I mean, people, the importance of war, you know, so much money, which is, you know, is going to the military right now. I mean, you know, the nuclear policies right now are absorbing enormous amounts of money, and they're really dangerous, and they're putting command over nuclear weapons in the hands of, you know, troops on the front line of danger areas and all across the NATO Soviet border, which is super dangerous and is getting very little public attention. And if you think about we're in this extremely volatile period, these military changes are extremely frightening because, and as the virus spreads through the Middle East and through the U.S. military, you begin to go back and think about historically how, in conditions of plagues and pandemics, military forces are brought into play in really weird ways. They used to in the Middle Ages, they would win wars by taking people sick with viruses and just catapulting them into the walls of cities, over the walls of cities, so they could take down those cities by getting them sick with the virus, by throwing people who had the virus right into the cities that they were trying to capture. So, Iran, for example, right now, they're now trying to tighten the sanctions even further on Iran. Iran is an epicenter of the virus. So you're seeing, and this has to do with oil and stuff, so it's very relevant to corporate issues, of course, but you're seeing the possibility of Iran is one of the most badly hit places. And the Trump administration, the neoconservatives are working very, very hard to essentially strangle this country and kill off a country that's being killed by a virus, And
no, it's like biological. It's honestly like biological warfare.
Yeah,
it's as close to biological warfare as you get.
Right. Which reminds me, this is sort of a tangent, but the fact that people can easily be turned against each other, so that I'm not quite sure how this connects, but I know that when you said biological warfare, people have been sometimes, when they're pissed off at each other, one person will turn it back against another person who's in line behind them. Or often this is right-wing young white guys who are part of, the Proud Boys or something like that. And they'll cough on and now some of these people are being arrested for terrorist activities and some of them, I thought of this, Rania, because this is, some of them are being arrested for biological war attacks and so forth.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you're seeing a whole bunch of new legal sort of ideas about what constitutes terrorism. But you can imagine how a right-wing regime would treat that and would consider protest movements among workers and so forth as a kind of biological terrorism.
It's interesting because like the last so I was actually living in the Middle East and I came back to the US because of this outbreak. I just wanted to be closer to my family. So I've been back for like a little over 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks. And in the last 3 weeks since I've been back, I found myself in this weird place because, obviously, like I'm a civil libertarian. I care about civil liberties and all these things are very important to me. But at the same time, I felt when I first got back that the government wasn't doing anything to stop the spread.
Right.
And so you end up in this sort of difficult situation where I do want the government to enforce social distancing. I do want the government to shut things down. And I do want the government, well, this is a leftist thing. I want the government to take over companies.
Well, let's just come back to that because
we'll put that in, but the point I want to make here, and I want to get your take on this, is because they let it spread so much before they did anything about it, you're put in this situation where like now I'm like, okay, I do want someone enforcing this. I do want a national presence to make this happen. And you find yourself being like, civil liberties are important, but at this point, like people need to be forced to not go to parks.
Right.
Like, it's like, what do you do? What do you do with that? Like, what do you do in that situation?
Take a couple of threads of what you're saying, which I think is really important. One is government. America is organized around a discourse of how bad government is for you, right? And I think one of the big paradigm shifts that might come out of this is the recognition that, these people who are being laid off in the millions are looking to government for their paychecks so they can pay their rent or they can buy groceries or something, right? And they're looking at public responders and saying, these people, this is sort of similar to what I was saying about workers, who are delivering groceries. They're looking at these government agencies and programs and saying, my God, my life, it's not just these black and brown people who they've always been told are just sponges. I'm a hardworking, working person, and I'm dependent on these government programs, whether it's, some sort of universal healthcare system, or some sort of universal employment system or wage thing and so forth, And then to go back to another point that you touched on, a lot of these corporate bailouts that we saw in 2008, which are resurfacing in new forms today, are, when you start to give Boeing and a lot of these other big companies these kinds of monies that are going out now, right after we gave them a $2 trillion stimulus, I mean, basically a tax break, which they'll just use for corporate executive pay. But there's a very good argument, which Obama, one of the few really good things that he did do was that when he did the auto bailout in 2010 or whenever it was, he said, well, the US government is going to take over 51% control of these companies, which was a recognition that American corporations exist largely at the behest of the American taxpayer. In other words, the only thing that keeps American corporations going is all the corporate welfare that the government is shoveling out to keep these corporations profitable. And so maybe in the current environment, it's going to become more obvious that the government is shoveling trillions of dollars at these big companies, and that should open up in people's minds, say, hey, that's my tax dollar. Why aren't I an owner, of Boeing? What the hell is Boeing making all this money off of my tax dollars and so forth by these bailouts? I should be, that should be a publicly owned company, or the company, like in Europe, there should be co-determination. There should be 50% of the board, or third of workers come, public and so forth. So I think a lot of these ideas that are sort of just ordinary in Europe around the idea of corporate structure and governance should be remade to reflect the realities of how corporations work, which is they work because of what workers do and because of the money that ordinary taxpayers shovel into corporate welfare programs. The public should own these companies or have a lot of control over the direction of them. So that's another potential thing that might become, just because the scale of this is so large and the amount of money that's going to be going to businesses is so great, that people are going to wonder, well, gee, maybe, okay, we need this government to help bail out all the millions of workers who can't pay their rent or get health care. We need a massive public health program. We need a massive jobs program. Maybe that's going to feed into some sort of Green New Deal or some sort of really important, the most obvious way you can sort of, we're dealing with a sort of matrix of existential disasters, one of which is climate change, one of which is nuclear war, one of which is the coronavirus meltdown. And, they interact and intersect with each other, so that maybe in coming to deal with, the coronavirus, which feels much more immediate than climate change, people will come to realize that one of the solutions to the coronavirus thing is bringing in a massive jobs program that is going to be green and sustainable. So you deal with several existential emergencies at the same time, because the climate emergency is not going away. And
Right.
so part of the deal that progressives have to be thinking about is, how do you, when you're dealing with several threats to the planet and to the survival of people, which is what we're dealing with. Long before the coronavirus, we were dealing with the reality that maybe we had 20 or 30 years more of a survivable planet. And now you're dealing with people trying to figure out how to pay their rent next month. But the solution to that problem is all intertwined with the fact that the planet could be devastated in 30 years. So we have to be really, really strategic in thinking about how to pull these things. But I think there isn't, again, just the positive thing is that the crisis is so big and so immediate that more than climate change, it might sort of bring people around to some of these solutions around public goods, public intervention. Remember, when you're living in a corporate society, the whole idea of a public good, meaning a good that's necessary for the public, but is not deliverable by the market because it might not be profitable enough. We're in a new world now. And the health crisis says, you need health care for people, even when it's not profitable for particular companies to go and do that. And so maybe healthcare is going to be a leading front where climate change, social welfare, sort of socialism of the Bernie Sanders style, whatever, it's going to be on the plate. There's just no way that that can be forced off.
I mean, I don't know. You still have Joe Biden going on TV defending private health insurance.
Yeah, well,
like it's crazy.
Biden is, if he's a nominee, and he's likely to be, is only going to win if he brings in a lot of very progressive constituencies.
So let me
Yeah, please. I'm
the conversation to a larger question.
Okay.
Going for 40 minutes here, but I want to cover one other area that you've explored before, and it sort of ties into this thing that we've been talking about here that might be positive, is that people are able to see these workers on the front lines, and that's going to make them more aware of what working class people are doing and the way they make our society function, and how we really can't survive without their contributions on a daily basis. And one thing that I will say is, as much as I loathe the corporate media and what it does to give us all the different propaganda that we have for how we tolerate certain things in our society that we probably shouldn't be so used to, one thing I've noticed about CNN is very regularly they're going to these workers who have contracted the coronavirus or who are dealing with coronavirus in the workplace. It's just something you didn't see before this outbreak. They weren't putting these kinds of voices on air on such a regular basis. So that's something that has been, I think, a net benefit to dealing with this pandemic collectively. The sense that we're all in it together. I think you're seeing elites start to recognize that they can get sick from poor people, from working people, just as much as rich people can get. We can get sick from rich people as well. And so I wanted to talk about this issue. Something you've explored before is who deserves safety and who doesn't deserve safety in a capitalist society, and how we are taught to think about who deserves these protections and who does not deserve these kinds of protections. And when we think of who makes up this force of people that are called essential workers right now, we see a lot of these people, and we're recognizing who gets to work from home, who doesn't have that luxury of being able to work from home. And I think that's a clear aspect of our capitalist economy. And also, this fact that they're paid so very little for what they're doing, that we don't really value what they're doing. I see that as being something, and you've explored before this dichotomy of the upstairs versus the downstairs, and how you have that structure, and that has some interplay with how you decide who deserves safety and who doesn't. So why don't you talk a little bit about that for us?
Okay, first of all, let me say, Kevin, I think you put that brilliantly. I think that was a really powerful and profound statement. I mean, I agree with you that the corporate media inadvertently is highlighting images of people we've always viewed as not worthy of being on TV and not worthy of chronicling. And I think you're right, because I watch a lot of TV, that we're seeing for the first time faces of ordinary working people who are generally, as you say, if you think of capitalism as an upstairs, downstairs architecture, and the people living downstairs or in the basement are almost never seen. There's no light down there. They're not in the public discussion. And the whole way the society is organized as well, there's a lot of stairways from the upward downstairs to the upstairs. So the people still on the bottom floors are worthless. They're people that really don't deserve our attention. And Kevin, I just think you put it really, really well, that now these are frontline people, as you say, and they're being partly featured that way, and they're being heard, and they're acting. You're seeing, you know, um, delivery workers and carpenters laid off, and healthcare custodians, and you're just seeing all these people who were invisible, which allowed the fundamentals of neoliberal capitalism to survive, which is the idea that we're stratified by a sense of value in terms of a small number of people who are viewed as essentially contributing the real creativity and value that our society offers, and a large number of people who are basically parasiting off those people who are the creative people sort of living upstairs or on the mezzanine or something like that. And so I think that that's, if you think that upstairs, downstairs, that capitalism is an upstairs, downstairs house. And the people in the downstairs are sort of shadowing and visible, and they're not worth very much. They're very often people of color and women and people, immigrants and people of other, they're not worthy. And so capitalism survives by imprinting in people this sense that we don't really need any kind of universal public goods because most of the public is not worthy of receiving it. They're losers. They're people who have not worked hard or have, they're criminals or they're sponging off the creative, hardworking people. And I think that whole paradigm is vulnerable to being shaken up today in the very way that you said, Kevin. And I think that's super important. I think that if that were to enter the public consciousness, as I think it's just beginning to now, and this sort of, maybe the corporate media will come to contradict itself in unsurprising ways, in the sense that these images are very, very powerful. And if you suddenly have a kind of bizarre flipping of this upstairs downstairs thing and say, wow, the people who are really keeping this house together are the people downstairs who never get to see the light of day and never get, a sense of being valued. And, once you do that, you really threaten the fundamentals of capitalism as we understand it, because capitalism is based on the idea that most people do not deserve protection. And that's why we don't have large universal human rights social programs that protect everybody, whether it's their health or their education or their housing or their food or whatever. So everything you were talking about, Kevin, in my mind is potentially shaking up the sort of brain image that keeps the whole system going. And when you shake that up, you're creating the preconditions of some sort of very big shift in the way people think about how economies should be organized and the way political systems work and so forth. And so I think that possibility is very real. And we want to do everything we can to encourage, this sort of new way of thinking about workers and frontline workers and working class people who are in the shadows and never get. I can't say I'm super optimistic that this picture will play out in the way that we would all like it to, but at least there's the possibility that this can emerge.
Right. It does seem like the one thing that we want to really make certain here, and then I'll let Rania get in before we would conclude our interview, but the one thing we really want to make certain we do is be more proactive than reactive, because it seems to me that the very nature of this capitalist system, which has a veneer of democracy interspersed within it to make us feel like we are able to make choices over our lives, that the very thing that we don't want is to just be primarily reactive. We want to push for political leaders, anybody who has any mechanisms of power that they're able to access. We want them to do things that are going to be proactive, that are looking towards where we might be 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, or even 5 to 10 years down the road based on what we're experiencing right now. Because, and something you've explored is the way that the right understands better than the left how to deal with people's irrationality and their emotions and how they're able to prey upon all of this. And the way they've been able to negotiate, because, among the right wing, they haven't actually agreed that the coronavirus outbreak is the kind of existential threat that the people on the left have agreed upon. So they've been manipulative in that regard. But then beyond that, there is this sense that I get that there's really this open conversation as to like how they're going to be able to manipulate this. And one clear advantage that Donald Trump has going through this year is that there is no nomination process going on for the Republican Party and picking their president. They have their person, and he gets to just sit in the White House and make this possible. So I think the challenge for us is how do we stay responsive to this in a way that isn't just dealing with putting out fires on a daily basis, but is sort of anticipating where those fault lines and fractures are going to be through the rest of this year, so that we can gain some kind of an edge over proto-fascist or authoritarian forces that are going to manipulate what is happening with this coronavirus outbreak.
Yeah. And I want to highlight what you said, Kevin, about irrationality, because the right wing gains legitimacy by um, understanding something about the kinds of irrational impulses that bind people together in the absence of genuine community. So Trump can use nationalism and xenophobia and militarism as a way, and anti-immigrant, you know, divisions and so forth, very effectively as a way of dividing people. And progressives have to use the electoral period right now and the sort of Justice Democrats and the movements that behind them, you know, the sort of, I mean, I talk about united fronts, by which I mean the real movements that make change in an election period. Very often, you know, Europe has developed a challenge to neoliberalism by bringing together fairly significant labor movements and you know, anti-poverty, women, a whole range of movements to challenge and to create, you know, green parties, feminist parties, other kinds of things that you don't see in the United States. So I think there is the proactive response is desperately needed. And, you know, it's going to be very interesting and important to how this works out, because when people are hit as hard as they are right now, the survival instinct, especially when you're dealing with social distancing and having to be alone in your room, it's very hard to feel hopeful and feel connected with people. At the same time, things are happening that we've been talking about over the last hour, which are quite hopeful and which are connecting people and are creating the kinds of change of landscape and change of, you know, the way people understand the world and the economy that I think is real. Because, you know, I don't think we're anywhere near seeing what's going to happen in the next few months. The level of the both the health crisis and the economic crisis is going to be extremely intense. And this whole idea that we're in a bell-shaped curve, which is going to go up, peak, and then go down, is violating the norms of historical plagues and pandemics. It's more like a roller coaster. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up again, and then goes down again. The economy keeps getting permanently, you know, shaped in a way that is devastating for, and that means economic, the possibility of re-envisaging a different type of economy when you have this much disruption and this much insecurity for millions and millions of people in the downstairs, particularly, but all over the map. I mean, it opens up a longer term horizon for the possibility of change. But you're absolutely right, Kevin. It's got to be super proactive from people on, you know, on the grassroots front of this, and then because like I say, if we look historically, the right wing uses these moments very effectively by seizing irrational impulses that are almost always brought into the legitimating political discourse of far right, you know, neo-fascist or authoritarian kinds of regimes that are highly nationalistic, highly militaristic, highly racist and sexist, and we're going to see.
Sounds like our country already. Sounds like our country already.
You're going to see a new level. Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, I think that's a really good point you make. This is the last thing I'll say. I foresee, I think you're already seeing it, the right taking advantage of this by making it all about a way to sort of ramp up this Cold War 2.0 with China. China is the big scapegoat. Like, this virus started in China, so it's very easy to get a population to just look at how devastating everything is, and instead of blaming capitalism or the government, right, saying China did this, let's punish China, and, you know, getting really nationalistic and America versus China about it. I could see that being a very successful way for Trump and the right to spin this in the long term.
Absolutely.
I could see a lot of the American public thing behind that, because even the liberal, but I mean, the sort of like anti-Trump media, liberal media, get behind that as well. They hate China. They're happy they'll just take all this Russiagate hysteria that's sort of like gone away right now because there's bigger issues, and they'll just take that and that whole mechanism, that whole apparatus, and just make it about China instead.
Right.
I could see that being extremely successful, and I think that's why what you guys are talking about is really important. For rather than being reactive, the left, the grassroots, the progressives do need to recognize that narrative and be able to have our own narrative that can overshadow that, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult going against an entire, a corporate owned media that has such a bigger voice than we do. Though at the same time, now everybody's just doing YouTube from inside their houses, so they're sort of reduced to what we already do.
Yeah.
Maybe we have a chance. I don't know.
And capitalism, like most of life, is full of contradictions. So, I mean, when Kevin was talking about the way CNN sometimes features these frontline workers, I think that's been a touchstone of this conversation. I think it's maybe the most important thing that we're getting, and corporate media is helping in this respect. It's giving a kind of experience of the working person who's been always invisible and degraded in America. And as they can become more female and people of color, even more so. And so I think this change that Kevin was really drilling down on, it's really important, but it ultimately, like both of you are saying, it depends on mobilization, anticipation. The war with China, Rania, that you're talking about, like most of these things, was in the works long before the coronavirus. So we know, for example, the Pentagon has been building so they've been assuming that, well, the Middle East is going to run out of oil, or we're going to move away. We have enough natural gas now. We don't have to worry about the Middle East oil. So where do we go? We go to China. So there was a big buildup of, military scenarios regarding China, that Trump was happy to play into in his trade wars and so forth. So almost this whole scenario, and it goes back to the reason you talked to me, which is that the current scenario is not, while it was unexpected, is really to a large degree a natural outcropping of things that were emerging long before it happened. It was a sort of reflection. It's like the emperor without his clothes, but it's the realization of things that have been building and shaping our lives for a very long time. And that's why you don't want a return to normalcy. This is what normalcy brought us, and we need a different kind of normal. And that's why I go back to Kevin's image. When he's talking about frontline workers getting central attention on CNN and so forth, that's not normal. There's something that's profoundly, there's just something, I'm really glad you landed on that, Kevin, because I think it's something that's potentially can really lift the movement, and lift the sort of feelings of ordinary people in a way that could change political conversation and change the way people think about the country and think about workers and so forth. So,
and one minor point just to make about that is that I think they've been forced into this democratization of voices, so to speak, because they're not locked into that studio anymore. Every single person that's joining into these broadcasts comes to them from their own homes. So when that's already a reality, when no matter what, they're going to join by, I think they're using the service from the corporation Cisco on CNN. But when you're going to use your own conferencing software tool, or you're going to use your own video tool to bring anybody in, then you can go to any person. You could go to me if you cared about independent journalists, or you go to Rania. You could go to people who are driving buses. You can go to people who work in hospitals, the nurses. You can go to just go down the list of all the essential services that are being provided. Any one of them gets to be the people who provide reports, and you don't have to put it in the hands of the pundits or the correspondents that get paid big money to go out there. You just go right to the sources and put them on air.
I agree with that. And there's something so powerful about that, getting the voices of people right out there. I mean, I just feel it in my gut that, when this kind of voice of the people is being, heard in a new way through new communication channels and in activist context, when that worker coming out of the warehouse is talking about what's going on in that warehouse, and it's coming out of one of these channels you're talking about, Kevin, and there's just, it moves me. It really does. And it makes me feel like there's something new going on here. And I think the right wing is going to really mobilize to try to crush it in its infancy. So I don't and I have enough sense of the reality of these right wing movements historically that I don't in any way, and the right wing is controlling much of the government right now. So it's dangerous. It's a really dangerous period, but there's these really significant moments of real transformational consciousness that we ought to seize on and move us. And, even during the election, even with a Biden candidacy, as bad as that is, there's an opportunity to use this moment in the election to go after the far right and to open up a new set. I think there are lots and lots, whether we're talking about the AOC type politics in the Democratic Party or the movement politics that are sort of, she says, I'm a movement person. Yeah, I happen to be in the House, but I'm going to sit in Nancy Pelosi's office when I have to, And I think if politics becomes so sort of infiltrated with a kind of what you're calling proactive grassroots activity, and these frontline workers start emerging, in the candidacies of these Democratic offices, and become frontline. A good thing about Biden is he's sort of so uncharismatic and so invisible that there's going to be a lot of other people representing what the Democratic Party is, and maybe if we see the faces of these frontline workers who become the voices of these candidates, that's going to be very powerful. It could move the political center of power, and it could move these underlying structures of capitalism in a way that we haven't seen before. So there are real possibilities here.
Well, that's rather a hopeful note to end on. So maybe we should do that. And
Okay.
do you have anything you wanted to say, Rania, before we wrap here?
I'm all good.
No, it's been great to talk to you, Charlie, and we hope you continue to stay safe in Boston, and as we all ride this out,
Where are
maybe
you, Kevin? Are you in?
I'm in Chicago.
You're in Chicago.
Yeah, which is an epicenter of its own that has been granted media attention throughout the country. Although I guess we get to say, unlike Rania, that we had a governor that recognized the threat fairly early and put us all into sheltering in place.
We're stay-at-home order. We have a stay-at-home order now in Virginia.
Oh, but that's fresh, right? Because I think when we talked a week or so ago, you were pretty frustrated that the governor.
I was tweeting it. I've been tweeting at the Virginia governor for 2 weeks, so I like to credit myself for convincing him to put in place a stay-at-home order. We also didn't have high numbers like you guys do, so hopefully it didn't come too late.
Well, Rania, the way you're coming around civil liberties and public, that's a really important internal conversation you're having that's going out into the country. It's important. And I think it has some very positive sides.
Yeah, I guess one thing I will note is, I know that there was the ACLU of Rhode Island was really upset because police were stopping people with New York license plates. But at the same time, if I was living in Rhode Island, I might be okay with that. I don't know. Because I don't think I think there maybe should be quarantines in certain parts of the country that have outbreaks, or else it will spread. So you do have this dilemma that we can finish that conversation another time. But I think it's a real dilemma when it comes to civil liberties. What do you do when there's a pandemic and there's a virus that's spreading?
That dilemma is where creative, proactive politics can emerge, because it's a real dilemma,
right?
And it opens up a whole set of really interesting questions. And so I wouldn't discount that dilemma. The struggle you're having around that issue is a politically productive struggle, and the way people resolve it will be really important, actually.
Right.
It can have some really positive dimensions to it. So I feel bad about being caught in an internal bind around that kind of thing,
Yeah.
Well, again, we both thank you for your work, and we'll continue to follow. You're writing books constantly still, so hopefully maybe we'll get a chance to check in towards the end of the year on the impacts of this crisis.
With you guys, call me anytime.
All right. Well, I'm going to end this broadcast. Here we go.
Okay. Take care. Be well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to the entire conversation with Charles Derber. And if you're a patron, we are very grateful to have your support. We know that these uncertain times are really tough for people, and some of you are going to find that you can no longer contribute. But then there's going to be some of you who can continue to contribute and support the show. And I'd like to make an appeal to you. I'd like to say that if you can go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, make a small monthly donation and become a regular supporter of the show, we'll be able to keep going strong throughout 2020 when we need voices like ours from the independent media to address what's going on with the unprecedented crises that we have unfolding here in the United States and around the world. And if you go there, you'll be able to unlock exclusive content. We're doing live stream sessions, especially while we're going through this outbreak. And Rania and myself are on lockdown and in quarantine. But we're also going to be posting content that's just available for the patrons. And we're going to be able to continue to produce these shows with guests like Charles Derber that get into a deeper analysis of what's going on. They're not just about reacting to the news of the past week, but digging deeper and having that political analysis so people can be smarter and understand what we need to be doing next in order to respond appropriately to this coronavirus outbreak and the crisis. So if you go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, become a patron today. Thank you.